Abu Bakr al Baghdadi, The Rise and Fall of the Caliph of Terror. Part 1. Roots of Radicalism, Birth, Ancestry, and Early Life in Samarra. Ibrahim Awwad Ibrahim Ali al-Badri, the man who would one day be known across the world as Abu Bakr al Baghdadi, was born on the 28th of July, 1971, in the ancient Iraqi city of Samarra, situated north of Baghdad along the banks of the Tigris River. Samarra's significance in Islamic history was profound. It had once served as a seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the golden age of Islamic rule. That his birth took place in such a storied city was a coincidence, but one that would later carry symbolic weight when he sought to revive the caliphate in his own name. He was born into a Sunni Arab family that traced its lineage to the tribal confederation of al-Badri. Among traditional Arab families, lineage was more than a matter of genealogy, was a source of social identity and prestige. The al-Badri tribe, with deep roots in central Iraq, claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad's Quraysh tribe. This connection, unproven but often asserted by Baghdadi's supporters, was emphasized later in his life as he sought religious legitimacy for his caliphate. Within Islamic tradition, a caliph was ideally from the Quraysh, and Baghdadi's claimed descent was a calculated assertion of inherited authority, even if its historical validity was never verified. Baghdadi's full name, Ibrahim Awwad Ibrahim Ali al-Badri al-Samarra, reflected the key elements of his heritage. Al-Badri denoted his tribal affiliation, while al-Samarra signified his place of birth. His family was regarded as pious and conservative. His father, Awwad Ibrahim, was a respected religious figure, a cleric known for his devout adherence to Sunni orthodoxy, and a man of considerable influence within the local religious community. His mother's name remains largely unknown in public records, but she too was remembered by local sources as a deeply religious woman, held in high regard within the tribe. Together, the parents instilled in their children a strict adherence to Islamic practice and a worldview centered on religious virtue, social conservatism, and suspicion towards secular modernity. Ibrahim was the third of 4 sons. His siblings would go on to follow various paths, with one becoming an officer in Saddam Hussein's military and another reportedly dying in one of Iraq's wars, either the bloody conflict with Iran or the Gulf War of the early 1990s. These early family dynamics were framed by Iraq's volatile and shifting political landscape, where religion, nationalism, and authoritarianism constantly intersected. Even in his early childhood, those who knew Ibrahim described him as unusually serious and withdrawn. Unlike many boys his age, who played soccer or roamed the streets of Samarra in carefree groups, he spent his free time in mosques, memorizing the Quran, praying, and studying under the guidance of his father. He was, by all accounts, soft-spoken, introverted, and fanatically devout. He avoided confrontations and kept to himself, showing little interest in worldly activities. But this apparent meekness belied a growing internal world structured around purity, discipline, and religious superiority. During his teenage years, Baghdadi's environment further reinforced his theological outlook. The 1980s were a turbulent time for Iraq. The country was engulfed in the protracted and devastating war with Iran, marked by sectarian undertones that echoed in religious communities. Baghdadi, raised in a Sunni household, absorbed the sectarian narratives that cast Shia Muslims, especially those aligned with the Iranian regime, as deviants and political enemies. These prejudices, formed early, would later explode in his violent crusade against Iraq's Shia population as leader of the Islamic State. His formal schooling in Samarra revealed both strengths and limitations. Although he failed his initial attempt at obtaining a high school certificate, he persisted and retook the examination in 1991, eventually earning a respectable score of 481 out of 600. Despite the improvement, his marks were not high enough to study more prestigious subjects like law, languages, or educational sciences at the University of Baghdad. This academic setback may have shaped the trajectory of his future. Redirected from his preferred career paths, he instead entered the Islamic University of Baghdad institution with a narrower focus, but one that would offer him the scholarly scaffolding to cloak future radicalism in theological legitimacy. It was at the Islamic University that he began his academic immersion in Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, Quranic recitation, tajwid, and theology, aqidah. His religious studies were intensive, emphasizing strict interpretations of Sunni Islam rooted in Salafi traditions. His teachers and classmates described him as studious but unremarkable, in personality serious, diligent, and largely invisible. He rarely socialized and was not known for charisma or leadership, but rather for his rigid devotion to religious texts. Outside the classroom, Baghdadi found increasing resonance in the writings of Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian ideologue whose works provided a theological framework for modern jihadist thought. Qutb's belief in a worldwide struggle between Islam and Jahiliyyah pre-Islamic ignorance fit neatly with Baghdadi's growing sense that modern society had strayed from the true path. For Baghdadi, Qutb's teachings would become more than just literature. They became a lens through which to interpret history, religion, and the fate of Muslims in the contemporary world. By the time he reached his 20s, Baghdadi was fully absorbed in the identity of a scholar-cleric. He wore traditional robes, grew his beard, and adopted the mannerisms of a man who saw himself as a future authority on matters of faith. In Baghdad's impoverished western neighborhoods, such as Tabshi, he lived in a small annex to a local mosque. For over a decade, he led quiet, seemingly innocuous religious instruction and Quranic recitation classes for children, never drawing the attention of state authorities or even local radical groups. He lived modestly, prayed fervently, and avoided conflict a shadow of the future caliph he would become. Yet beneath the calm surface, the ideological currents within him were deepening. The Iraqi regime under Saddam Hussein's secular and fiercely nationalistic offered no outlet for religious revolutionaries like Baghdadi. But his resentment simmered, quietly cultivating the idea that Islam had been betrayed by corrupt rulers, Western invaders, and internal deviants. In his mind, he was preparing not for scholarly distinction, but for divine warfare. These formative Yearshi's conservative upbringing, tribal affiliations, clerical lineage, and quiet theological rigor shaped the man who would later emerge as a symbol of terror. The man the world would come to fear, as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was first molded in the dusty streets of Samarra and the austere mosques of Baghdad. He was not born a warrior, but a preacher. Not a commander, but a contemplative. It would take war, chaos, and imprisonment to transform him from a recluse into a revolutionary. Part 2. From Scholar to Soldier. Theological Ambition and the Path to Militancy. By the early 1990s, Ibrahim Awwad al-Badri had begun to transform from a reclusive theology student into a figure with greater religious ambition. At the Islamic University of Baghdad, his academic pursuit of Islamic studies took on a deeper personal dimension. He was no longer simply a young man seeking knowledge. He was beginning to see himself as part of a mission. The lectures he attended on jurisprudence, the hours spent memorizing Quranic verses, and his growing exposure to hardline Salafi literature reinforced his belief that he was destined to play a role in correcting the course of Muslim society. Baghdadi, as he would later be known, absorbed a fundamentalist worldview, a vision in which the modern world was not only failing Islam, but actively opposing it. While there is some scholarly dispute about the specifics of his academic record, many sources agree that he earned a bachelor's, master's, and eventually a PhD. in Islamic studies, with a focus on Quranic recitation, tajwid, and jurisprudence. His doctoral work, reportedly completed in 2007, involved editing and interpreting a medieval religious manuscript. This scholarly achievement was framed by his supporters as proof of his religious credentials, giving him the image of a legitimate Islamic scholar. Although unremarkable in academic circles, the degree provided a crucial ideological tool: theological legitimacy. This would prove invaluable years later when he would seek to justify the creation of an Islamic State and his claim to the caliphate. By the turn of the millennium, Baghdadi had become an imam in Baghdad. He led prayers, taught the Quran, and provided religious guidance in the impoverished neighborhood of Tabchi, a mixed Sunni-Shia area on the western edge of the capital. Those who knew him during this period described him as deeply introverted, strict in religious practice, and uninterested in worldly pleasures. He dressed modestly, rarely socialized, and was known to correct others' religious conduct with quiet persistence. Despite his religious qualifications, Baghdadi remained obscure and was not considered a significant figure among Iraq's Sunni clerics. His influence was confined to the mosque and its surrounding community, far from the political or militant spotlight. However, the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 changed everything. The collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime created a massive power vacuum, unleashing chaos, sectarian violence, and ideological polarization across the country. For many Iraqis, the occupation became a rallying cry, a grievance that would give rise to resistance movements and religious radicalization. Baghdadi was among those who saw the invasion as a confirmation of everything he believed: that Islam was under siege, and that the time for passive scholarship was over. In the wake of the invasion, Baghdadi moved swiftly to act. Drawing from his network of religious contacts and tribal links, he helped establish an insurgent group called Jama'at Jaysh al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, roughly translated as the Army of the Sunni People. This militant faction operated in the Sunni heartland, targeting coalition forces and aligning itself ideologically with Salafi jihadism. Baghdadi took on a leadership role in the group, likely serving as its spiritual and administrative head. This marked his full transformation from cleric to combatant, from scholar of hadith to commander of jihad. The decision to take up arms was not a sudden leap, but a gradual evolution. The destruction of Iraq's institutions, the rise of Shiite militias backed by Iran, and the increasing marginalization of Sunni communities all fed into Baghdadi's growing belief that violence was not only justified, but divinely mandated. His theological training gave him the tools to articulate jihad as a religious duty, and he used verses from the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad to justify armed resistance. His role in Jama'at Jaysh al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah also introduced him to Iraq's expanding jihadist network. The most notable of these was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, led at the time by the Jordanian-born militant Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. While Baghdadi operated on a smaller scale, his ideological alignment with Zarqawi's group set the stage for eventual collaboration. In 2004, that connection would deepen dramatically when Baghdadi was arrested by U.S. forces. Baghdadi was detained while visiting the home of a former student in Fallujah, a city that had become one of the strongholds of insurgent activity. Initially labeled a low-level detainee, he was processed under his real name, Ibrahim Awwad Ibrahim al-Badri, and was sent to Camp Bucca, a sprawling detention facility in southern Iraq. What might have been a short detention for a relatively minor religious figure turned into a formative experience that shaped his destiny. At Camp Bucca, Baghdadi was held among thousands of other prisoners, many of them seasoned jihadists, ex-military officers, and members of al-Qaeda in Iraq. U.S. officials believed they were separating radicals from the battlefield, but in reality, the camp functioned as a crucible of jihadist networking. Baghdadi was quiet, respectful, and devout during his time there. He led prayers, studied religious texts, and began building relationships with other militants. These alliances would later provide the foundation for the leadership cadre of what would become the Islamic State. One former U.S. official would later remark, "We had no idea who we had." To the Americans, Baghdadi was another unremarkable detainee. But to the other prisoners, he began to emerge as a man of religious authority and tactical patience. When he was released in December 2004, reportedly due to being classified as a low-level threat, walked away from Camp Bakr not weakened, but strengthened, with a network of future collaborators and a clearer vision of jihad as a global movement. From 2004 onward, Baghdadi's life was no longer confined to dusty mosques or scholarly manuscripts. He had stepped into the shadows of insurgency. The once obscure cleric had begun a new journey, one that would lead to the most devastating and far-reaching jihadist enterprise of the 20th century. The next chapter in his life would see him climb the ranks of a brutal organization, forge alliances with the most dangerous extremists of his time, and ultimately attempt to reshape the Muslim world under the banner of a new caliphate. Part 3. Ascension Through the Shadows. Baghdadi and the Rise of the Islamic State of Iraq. After his release from Camp Bakr in late 2004, Ibrahim Awwad Ibrahim, to become more widely known as Abu Bakr al Baghdadi, entered Iraq's devastated landscape with a renewed sense of purpose and a cadre of new allies. Though he had been detained as a low-level threat, he now possessed something far more valuable than weapons or manpower: ideological legitimacy, a growing network of seasoned jihadists, and the patience to outlast his enemies. The chaos in post-invasion Iraq was fertile ground for religious extremism, and Baghdadi would use it to build something far larger than the Americans or Iraqis could have imagined. Following his release, Baghdadi reconnected with his former group, Jama'at Jaish al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, JJASJ, a mid-sized Sunni insurgent faction, active in the so-called Sunni Triangle. As one of its religious figures, Baghdadi helped guide operations that targeted U.S. forces, Iraqi government troops, and Shia militias. The group soon joined a broader umbrella organization in 2006 called the Mujahideen Shura Council, MSC, a coalition led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's al-Qaeda in Iraq. The MSC was an attempt to unify various Sunni insurgent groups under a single banner, and it was in this crucible that Baghdadi's influence began to expand. When Zarqawi was killed in a U.S. airstrike in 2006, al-Qaeda in Iraq underwent a transformation. That same year, the group formally rebranded itself as the Islamic State of Iraq, ISI, signaling its intention not just to wage jihad, but to govern territory as a state-like entity. Baghdadi, with his religious credentials and scholarly demeanor, was appointed to ISI's Sharia Comitia, body responsible for providing theological guidance, approving religious rulings, and enforcing ideological discipline within the ranks. It was in this role that Baghdadi began to hone his authority. Unlike many of the group's leaders, who came from military or tribal backgrounds, Baghdadi had the academic grounding to offer legalistic interpretations of Islam. He acted as a bridge between fighters and clerics, lending religious weight to acts of terror, executions, and political assassinations. Slowly, he moved up the organization's hierarchy, impressing superiors with his unyielding orthodoxy and organizational discipline. When Abu Omar al-Baghdadi, the then leader of ISI, and Abu Ayyub al-Masri, the group's military commander, were killed in a joint USS Iraqi raid in April 2010, ISI was at a crossroads. The group was fractured, weakened by internal dissent and under immense pressure from security forces. In a surprise decision, the Shura Council of ISI named Abu Bakr al Baghdadi as its new emir on May 16, 2010. His selection was not merely due to his religious background, it was also a statement that the group would double down on its theocratic goals. Under Baghdadi's leadership, the Islamic State of Iraq began to reconstitute itself. Initially, the group focused on rebuilding its underground network, recruiting former Ba'athist officers, smuggling weapons, and extorting Sunni communities under the guise of religious enforcement. In a war-weary Iraq, Baghdadi's group found opportunity. The withdrawal of U.S. forces, the weakness of the Iraqi central government, and sectarian violence gave him cover to expand operations. Baghdadi directed a brutal campaign of violence designed to destabilize the Iraqi government and ignite Sunni resentment. Between March and April 2011, ISI claimed responsibility for more than 20 attacks across central Iraq. These weren't random acts of terror, they were coordinated assaults on military outposts, police stations, and political leaders. One of the most notable operations under Baghdadi's command came on August 28, 2011, when a suicide bomber targeted the al-Qura Mosque in Baghdad, killing a prominent Sunni lawmaker and dozens of worshippers. It was a message to both government loyalists and Sunni rivals. Baghdadi was willing to destroy anything that stood in his path, including fellow Sunnis who rejected his vision. Baghdadi's approach combined medieval brutality with modern organizational efficiency. He instituted strict internal discipline, executed rivals within the movement, and built a sophisticated chain of command. He empowered local emirs, delegated authority to regional commanders, and encouraged innovation in tactics including the widespread use of suicide bombers, car bombs, and assassinations. In 2011, following the death of Osama bin Laden, Baghdadi released a statement praising the al-Qaeda founder as a martyr and pledging revenge. Shortly after, IC launched one of its bloodiest waves of attacks in the country, culminating in a vow to execute 100 operations in retaliation. On December 22, 2011, a coordinated series of bombings rocked Baghdad, killing at least 63 people in one day. A statement released by ISI shortly afterward claimed credit and described the attacks as strategically distributed to target security headquarters and so-called apostate gatherings. At the same time, Baghdadi became increasingly elusive. He rarely appeared in public, and even within ISI, few people had direct access to him. His physical secrecy helped create a mythos-the image of a ghost emir, someone always present, yet never visible. The U.S. and Iraqi governments struggled to capture or even locate him. This secrecy would become one of his most potent weapons. It preserved his life, protected the organization's structure, and enhanced his mystique. By the end of 2012, Baghdadi had transformed a fragmented, semi-defeated militant group into a resurgent terrorist network. He had emerged as a formidable figure, intellectual, invisible, and increasingly ambitious. But Iraq was no longer enough. As civil war engulfed neighboring Syria, Baghdadi saw an unprecedented opportunity to expand his reach. The next chapter of his journey would take him across a border, into a brutal conflict, and into a confrontation that would forever change the trajectory of global jihad. Part 4. Into the Inferno, the Syrian War, ISIL's Rise, and the Break with al-Qaeda. By 2013, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi stood on the precipice of a new jihadist revolution. The Islamic State of Iraq, ISI, had been revitalized under his leadership, but Baghdadi's ambitions reached far beyond the borders of Iraq. Just across the western frontier, Syria was descending into a brutal civil war. The chaos, fragmentation, and sectarianism engulfing the country made it an irresistible theater of expansion for Baghdadi's vision of a transnational Islamic empire. In that turmoil, he saw not just opportunity, but providence. In April 2013, Baghdadi released a bold statement announcing the rebranding of his organization as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. ISIL, alternatively known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. This new entity, he declared, would operate not only in Iraq but also in Syria. More controversially, he announced that Jabhat al-Nusra Front, a powerful jihadist group already fighting in Syria and loyal to al-Qaeda, was in fact a mere extension of ISI and would now be absorbed into ISIL. The announcement sent shockwaves through the jihadist world. The leader of al-Nusra, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, immediately rejected Baghdadi's assertion and publicly affirmed loyalty instead to Ayman al-Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden's successor as head of al-Qaeda. Julani's move enraged Baghdadi, who responded by dismissing Zawahiri's authority altogether. He would not surrender command of his forces in Syria, nor would he retract his claim. The ideological breach was complete. In February 2014, al-Qaeda officially disavowed ISIL, breaking all ties with Baghdadi and condemning his unilateralism and brutality. But by then, it was too late to stop the momentum. Baghdadi had already deployed his commanders and fighters across northern and eastern Syria, quickly seizing territory, weapon depots, oil facilities, and border crossings. In the city of Raqqa, ISIL expelled al-Nusra fighters and declared it the first provincial capital of the Islamic State. In Deir ez-Zor, vicious clashes broke out between ISIL and other rebel factions. ISIL proved more organized, more ruthless, and more ambitious than its counterparts. Within months, it had absorbed or eliminated rivals, securing control over vast stretches of Syrian territory. Baghdadi's success in Syria was due in part to his tactical flexibility. He was pragmatic about alliances, making temporary pacts with tribal leaders or opportunistic warlords, and he understood the power of spectacle. ISIL released slick, stylized propaganda videos through its media arm, Al-Furqan, designed to terrorize enemies and seduce potential recruits. These videos showcased executions, punishments, and battlefield victories, all framed as divine justice. Crucially, Baghdadi's group benefited from private funding networks in the Gulf states, particularly in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Though these governments officially condemned ISIL, private donors sympathetic to the group's ideology provided millions in aid, arms, and logistics. Meanwhile, ISIL launched recruitment drives on social media, attracting fighters from Europe, North Africa, Central Asia, and the Arab world. For many young radicals, Baghdadi's Islamic State offered a thrilling promise, the chance to fight in an authentic jihad and to live under what they believed was the first true caliphate in a century. Within Syria, ISIL implemented its interpretation of Sharia with ferocious intensity. In areas under its control, public beheadings, stonings, amputations, and crucifixions became routine. Smokers were flogged, women were forced into niqabs, and music was banned. Tribal dissenters, journalists, and activists were executed without mercy. Despite the brutality, ISIL managed to build rudimentary state structures, Sharia courts, religious police, tax departments, and social services. Baghdadi understood that governing, even through fear, was essential to legitimacy. His rhetoric also evolved. Baghdadi now invoked history with increasing frequency. In his communiques, he referred to medieval Islamic empires, the Abbasid Caliphate, and even eschatological prophecies. In one chilling statement, he promised that his soldiers would soon march to Rome, referring symbolically to the West and Christianity, echoing ancient Islamic, apocalyptic visions of conquest. His ambition was no longer regional. It was global, apocalyptic, and eternal. This expansionism was not without opposition. The Syrian opposition, already fractured, was horrified by ISIL's brutality. Al-Qaeda viewed Baghdadi's independence as rebellion. Even Iran-backed Shia militias entered Syria to counter the ISIL advance. Yet despite this growing coalition of enemies, ISIL's war machine surged forward, consuming terrain, oil fields, and lives in equal measure. Throughout 2013 and early 2014, Baghdadi's name became increasingly feared and his image more mythical. He still avoided public appearances, remaining hidden from view. To many, he was the invisible sheikh, a ghost who ruled from the shadows. But this illusion would not last much longer. Baghdadi was preparing for a dramatic unveiling. He believed the time had come for a bold proclamation known that would elevate him above all other jihadist leaders and seal his place in history. On June 29, 2014, the first day of Ramadan, ISIL announced the establishment of a worldwide caliphate. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant was now simply the Islamic State, IS. Its borders, Baghdadi claimed, extended wherever Muslims pledged allegiance to the Caliph. And Baghdadi himself? He was no longer an emir or a commander. He was now Caliph Ibrahim, the commander of the faithful. The declaration reverberated across the world. Middle Eastern governments, Sunni scholars, and rival jihadist groups roundly rejected the claim. Esteemed theologians like Yusuf al-Qaradawi denounced it as a distortion of Islamic law, warning that only the entire Muslim Ummah had the right to appoint a caliph. But among jihadist youth, disillusioned rebels, and alienated Muslims abroad, the news had a powerful, intoxicating effect. Baghdadi's gamble had paid off. He had defied al-Qaeda, survived foreign invasions, and transformed a regional insurgency into a self-declared state. For the first time in decades, a jihadist leader had not only dreamed of the caliphate, but announced it to the world. The caliphate had been proclaimed, the world would never be the same. Part 5. The Black Banner Ascends. Caliphate Rule, Terror, and the Machinery of Brutality. When Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi stood atop the pulpit of the Great Mosque of al-Nuri in Mosul on July 4, 2014, dressed in black robes and a turban in the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, the world glimpsed the once invisible figure who had declared himself Caliph Ibrahim, leader of the newly proclaimed Islamic State. For years, Baghdadi had shunned public appearances, but now, standing in one of Iraq's most historic mosques, he made himself visible, embodying not only religious authority but political sovereignty. It was a moment carefully choreographed to convey legitimacy, symbolism, and defiance. At its height in 2014 and 2015, the Islamic State under Baghdadi controlled an estimated 100 square kilometers of territory straddling Iraq and Syria, a landmass larger than the United Kingdom. It ruled over millions of people, with major strongholds in Mosul, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, Fallujah, and Ramadi. Oil fields, border crossings, dams, and towns fell swiftly into its hands. Baghdadi had succeeded where other jihadist leaders had only fantasized. He had built a functioning, if horrific, state. Baghdadi's caliphate was not merely a battlefield command center. It was a comprehensive system of governance enforced through terror and ideology. He appointed governors, walis, for each province, created ministries to oversee taxation, education, health, and even antiquities, and established Sharia courts with brutal sentencing powers. The Diwan system, modeled after early Islamic bureaucracy, was rolled out across IS-held territory. At the center of this structure was Baghdadi himself, a figure shrouded in mystery, issuing orders through emissaries and communiques, invisible but omnipresent. The Islamic State under Baghdadi quickly became synonymous with savagery. Public executions, floggings, crucifixions, and amputations were conducted in town squares and filmed in high definition for global distribution. The world recoiled at the release of IS propaganda videos showing masked fighters beheading Western journalists, aid workers and prisoners. One video showed the immolation of a captured Jordanian pilot in a metal cage. Another featured a child executing prisoners on behalf of the caliphate. Baghdadi's regime not only targeted military opponents, but also religious minorities. In the Sinjar region of Iraq, IS committed what the United Nations would later recognize as genocide against the Yazidi people. Thousands of Yazidi men were slaughtered. Women and children were abducted. The women, some as young as 9, were trafficked through a system of organized sexual slavery, sold in markets, or gifted to fighters. Baghdadi personally kept several of these girls as sex slaves. Kayla Mueller, an American humanitarian worker, was reportedly among those enslaved and raped repeatedly by Baghdadi himself. This systematic cruelty was not arbitrary, it was strategic. Baghdadi understood that brutality was propaganda. IS's gruesome acts were designed to terrify enemies, radicalize sympathizers, and attract recruits. Foreign fighters from Tunisia, Chechnya, Europe, and Asia poured into IS territory. Online, the group launched Dabiq, a digital magazine named after a site in Islamic eschatology where an apocalyptic battle was foretold. The magazine and accompanying videos presented life in the Islamic State as a utopia for devout Muslims, orderly, pure, and heroic. In truth, it was a regime of submission and fear. Economically, Baghdadi's Islamic State became the richest terrorist organization in history. Its revenue streams were diverse and deeply cynical. Oil smuggling, ransom payments, extortion, taxation of local populations, looting of antiquities, and even trafficking of historical artifacts on the black market. The group reportedly earned hundreds of millions of dollars annually, funding both local governance and international terrorism. Baghdadi's influence extended beyond the Middle East. His calls for allegiance resonated with extremist cells worldwide. In Nigeria, Boko Haram pledged loyalty to the Islamic State, becoming West Africa province. In Libya, Afghanistan, the Sinai Peninsula, and parts of Southeast Asia, jihadist factions rebranded themselves as affiliates. Baghdadi had built not just a state, but a global brand of jihad, eclipsing al-Qaeda in both visibility and horror. But as expanded, its enemies consolidated. A U.S.-led coalition began systematic airstrikes in both Syria and Iraq. Iraqi government forces, aided by Iran-backed Shia militias, pushed back. Kurdish fighters from the Peshmerga and YPG, backed by Western Special Forces, played a critical role in reclaiming territory. Baghdadi, meanwhile, remained in hiding, moving between safe houses, issuing fatwas, and operating through a tight inner circle. His strategy was to decentralize leadership, avoid direct exposure, and maintain the illusion of omnipotence. Internally, however, cracks were forming. Commanders began to die in drone strikes. IS's brutality alienated local populations. Cities once welcoming turned against the group's fanatical rule. Economic collapse set in as oil fields were retaken and supply routes severed. Even foreign fighters became disillusioned as the utopia promised by Dabiq turned into a nightmare of shortages, paranoia, and death. In 2015 and 2016, as the group began to hemorrhage territory, Baghdadi's speeches took on a desperate tone. In audio recordings released through Al Furqan Media, he urged his followers to fight to the death, to resist the crusaders and apostates, and to commit martyrdom rather than surrender. He condemned the Saudi royal family, threatened attacks in Europe, and promised the conquest of Rome and Jerusalem, a fantasy that seemed increasingly detached from the collapsing reality of his caliphate. Still, Baghdadi's influence lingered. Even as was being beaten back on the battlefield, lone wolf attackers in Paris, Brussels, Orlando, Nice, and Manchester carried out horrific acts in his name. These attacks, often inspired rather than directed, were the product of years of ideological seeding. Baghdadi may have been cornered in Iraq and Syria, but his voice, amplified by the internet and sanctified by martyrdom, reached around the globe. At its peak, the caliphate was an empire of violence, a dystopian state bound together not by hope or prosperity, but by fear, faith, and force. Baghdadi had built it from the ruins of two broken nations. But the black flag that once flew triumphantly over Mosul and Raqqa was now starting to fall, one city at a time. Part 6. The Fall of the Caliphate. Retreat, Resistance, and the Vanishing Caliph. By 2016, the empire that Abu Bakr al Baghdadi had built through terror and fear was beginning to unravel. What had once been an audacious jihadist state, stretching from the outskirts of Aleppo to the gates of Baghdad, was now shrinking under a relentless onslaught from a global coalition of adversaries. The Islamic State's reign, marked by grand proclamations, medieval governance, and unspeakable atrocities, had reached its zenith. Now, under the pressure of overwhelming military force, it began to collapse. But Baghdadi did not disappear. Instead, he slipped into deeper obscurity, continuing to guide his decaying caliphate from the shadows, clinging to his identity as the commander of the faithful even as his dominion crumbled. The military decline began in earnest with the Battle of Kobani in late 2014 and early 2015. Kurdish YPG forces, bolstered by U.S. air power, managed to repel IS fighters in one of the first significant defeats suffered by Baghdadi's troops. From that moment onward, the momentum slowly shifted. One city after another was wrested from Islamic State-controlled Tikrit, Sinjar, Fallujah, Ramadi, and finally Mosul, the crown jewel of the caliphate and the site of Baghdadi's only known public appearance. The Battle of Mosul, which lasted from October 2016 to July 2017, was a turning point. Iraqi forces, supported by U.S. and coalition partners, launched a massive urban offensive to retake the city. The fighting was brutal and prolonged, with IS forces using tunnels, snipers, human shields, and suicide bombers to resist every advance. But they could not hold. After nearly 9 months of devastation, the city was liberated. The Great Mosque of al-Nuri, where Baghdadi had once declared the caliphate, was blown up by retreating IS forces in a symbolic admission of defeat. It was as if Baghdadi himself had erased the stage of his coronation. As cities fell, Baghdadi's whereabouts became an obsession for intelligence agencies. He no longer had the luxury of statehood or protected territory. According to captured aides and defectors, Baghdadi was constantly on the move, traversing the Iraq-Syria border, hiding in desert enclaves, and traveling at night disguised as a common shepherd. He never used phones, traveled without convoys, and was accompanied only by a handful of trusted guards. His health reportedly deteriorated. He suffered from diabetes, high blood pressure, and the stress of life in hiding. Still, Baghdadi maintained control over what remained of the Islamic State. He appointed governors, directed propaganda efforts, and continued to encourage attacks abroad. His communications, though infrequent, were impactful. In audio messages released by IS media arms, he urged his followers to persevere, to embrace martyrdom, and to liberate imprisoned comrades. These recordings were laced with religious references, promises of paradise, and calls for worldwide jihad. In one such address, he told followers to erupt volcanoes of jihad everywhere, a chilling directive that preceded deadly attacks in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Despite mounting losses, Baghdadi's Islamic State did not vanish immediately. Fighters retreated to the Middle Euphrates River Valley, digging in across towns like Hajin, Baghouz, and Dashisha. From there, they waged guerrilla warfare against Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, and coalition forces. The final months of IS's territorial existence were marked by desperation. Civilians were trapped in besieged towns, human shields were forced to accompany militants, and entire families perished in airstrikes and shelling. Meanwhile, Baghdadi's paranoia grew. Intelligence reports and first-hand testimony from his brother-in-law, Muhammad Ali Sajid, painted a picture of an increasingly distrustful and isolated man. He suspected many of his governors of betrayal. He kept a suicide vest with him at all times and ordered his closest companions to do the same. His network became smaller, more tightly controlled, and increasingly cut off from the outside world. He was said to have disguised himself in tribal garb and relied on couriers to communicate. According to Sajid, he once had to hide Baghdadi in a pit near the Syrian border to escape detection. Even as the world searched for him, rumors of Baghdadi's death emerged repeatedly. In 2015, he was reported injured in an airstrike near al-Badri, allegedly suffering spinal injuries. In 2016, he was said to have been killed in Raqqa Falls. In 2017, Russian sources claimed he had died in an airstrike on the outskirts of the city. Each time, Baghdadi defied expectations and resurfaced, usually through audio recordings. These rumors, though incorrect, served to build his myth. A leader too elusive to be captured, too important to fall. His final territorial bastion, Baghouz Fawqani, a riverside village in eastern Syria, was surrounded in early 2019. Thousands of fighters, including foreign women and children, were trapped there under heavy bombardment. The last holdout collapsed in March 2019, bringing an end to the physical caliphate that Baghdadi had once declared eternal. The black flag had fallen, the cities had been retaken, but Baghdadi had once again escaped. In April 2019, for the first time in nearly 5 years, Baghdadi appeared in a new video released by IS Media. Sitting cross-legged beside an assault rifle, surrounded by masked aides, he acknowledged the fall of Baghouz and praised terror attacks around the world, including the Easter bombings in Sri Lanka that had just killed over 250 people. The video was a declaration of survival and reinvention. "Jihad is ongoing," he said calmly. "Victory comes with patience." But the veneer of power was fading. Baghdadi's words rang hollow as his organization lay in ruins. His followers were scattered, imprisoned, or dead. His empire had crumbled under the weight of its own brutality and the sustained assault of the global community. What remained of the Islamic State was now an insurgent network, decentralized, damaged, and directionless. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the man who once ruled over millions, now wandered through Syria's deserts, hunted, aged, and isolated. His caliphate was gone, his myth was breaking, and his time was running out. Part 7. The Final Fugitive, Hunted, Cornered, and Killed. As the Islamic State's territorial empire disintegrated in early 2019, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, once the most powerful and feared jihadist on earth, had become a ghost-hunted man, clinging to survival in the ravaged lands between Iraq and Syria. The caliphate he had declared with grand fanfare 5 years earlier no longer existed. His capital cities of Raqqa and Mosul were piles of rubble. His fighters were either dead, imprisoned, or scattered in lawless desert outposts. The Islamic State's propaganda machine continued to churn, urging attacks and promising rebirth, but behind it all, Baghdadi was increasingly alone, haunted by paranoia, illness, and the specter of capture. International intelligence agencies had placed Baghdadi at the very top of their wanted lists. The United States, through its Rewards for Justice program, offered $25 million for information leading to his capture or death. He was a specially designated global terrorist, accused not only of mass murder and war crimes, but also of personally ordering the enslavement and repeated rape of hostages, including Kayla Mueller, an American aid worker. Yet, despite a web of informants and a constant stream of satellite surveillance, Baghdadi continued to elude detection. His precise location remained maddeningly uncertain. Throughout 2017 and 2018, Baghdadi was believed to have moved stealthily between eastern Syria and western Iraq, always avoiding electronic devices, never remaining in one location for more than a few days. He traveled in small, inconspicuous group snow convoys, no elaborate security. He often disguised himself in civilian clothes, sometimes posing as a shepherd. According to reports from captured IS members and his own brother-in-law, Mohammed Ali Sajid, Baghdadi's fear of betrayal ran deep. He refused to fast during Ramadan for health reasons, kept a suicide vest on his body at all times, and ordered his companions to do the same. If captured, he would die by his own hand. A break in the manhunt came in mid-2019 when U.S. underprodings and Iraqi intelligence services, working in cooperation with Kurdish forces and local informants, began tracking Baghdadi's couriers. These messengers were critical. They carried his orders to IS remnants and helped coordinate regional affiliates. One courier, who had been under surveillance for months, led agents to an unlikely place, Idlib province, in northwest Syria. Controlled not by IS, but by rival jihadist factions and anti-Assad rebels, Idlib seemed an improbable hiding place. Yet its fractured, lawless environment offered Baghdadi a unique form of concealment. Enemies were unlikely to search there. Confirmation came after a high-level raid on Baghdadi's courier network. Among those captured was Mohammed Ali Sajid, who revealed key details about Baghdadi's movements, habits, and location. Sajid confessed that Baghdadi was hiding in the village of Barisha, in a remote compound surrounded by olive trees, near the Turkish border. The compound had been purchased under an alias and guarded by trusted IS loyalists. The United States now had its target. The raid was approved by President Donald Trump and executed by the elite UNIS Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta Force, supported by 75 Ranger Regiment troops and 160th SOAR helicopter pilots. The assault required meticulous coordination. Russian, Turkish, Iraqi, and Kurdish officials were quietly informed, as U.S. forces would be flying through contested airspace. On the night of October 26-27, 2019, American helicopters lifted off from Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan and crossed into Idlib, zeroing in on Baghdadi's hideout. What followed was a high-risk, high-speed operation. Delta Force soldiers landed near the compound and quickly breached its perimeter, calling for those inside to surrender. Baghdadi, realizing that capture was imminent, fled into a tunnel with 2 young children believed to be his own. Chased by a military working dog named Conan, he reached a dead end. According to President Trump's subsequent announcement, Baghdadi detonated his suicide vest, killing himself and the 2 children instantly. The tunnel collapsed. His body was torn apart, but later positively identified through DNA testing on site, using a sample previously obtained during his detention at Camp Bucca years earlier. No U.S. personnel were lost in the operation, Trump said. He died like a dog. He died like a coward. The president's language was blunt, but the message was clear. The world's most wanted terrorist had been eliminated. General Kenneth Frank McKenzie, head of U.S. Central Command, later confirmed the details. 2 Delta Force operators were slightly injured, and Conan, the dog that had chased Baghdadi into the tunnel, suffered minor wounds but recovered quickly. Sensitive materials, including computers and documents, were seized during the raid. The operation was later named after Kayla Muller, the American aid worker murdered while in IS captivity. After confirming Baghdadi's identity, U.S. forces buried his remains at sea, mirroring the treatment of Osama bin Laden's body 8 years earlier. The aim was to prevent the emergence of a shrine or burial site that could become a symbol of martyrdom. Islamic funeral rites were reportedly performed before the burial. The Islamic State, now a scattered network of insurgents and loyalists, acknowledged Baghdadi's death in a statement published on October 31, 2019. They named a new leader, Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurashi, another shadowy figure whose legitimacy, like Baghdadi's before him, was cloaked in genealogical claims and vague religious credentials. But Baghdadi's death marked the end of an era. His caliphate, once a genocidal statelet carved into the heart of the Middle East, was gone. His reign of terror, brutal, apocalyptic, and shrouded in theological justification, had collapsed into dust and tunnels. The man who had claimed divine authority to rule the world had died in hiding, clutching children, cornered not by armies, but by a dog and the collapse of his own delusions. Part 8. Legacy of Blood. The Caliph's Shadow over Jihad and Global Terror. The death of Abu Bakr al Baghdadi in late 2019 closed a chapter in modern jihadism, but it did not erase the marks he had left on the world. As the dust settled over the destroyed compound in Barisha, analysts, historians, and intelligence agencies began to assess the magnitude of Baghdadi's impact. What had begun as the life of a quiet theology student in Samarra had evolved into one of the most consequential and catastrophic jihadist careers in modern history. His legacy was not simply a dead leader or a defeated state. It was a sprawling, ideological shadow, one that would haunt nations, communities, and policies for decades to come. Baghdadi had done what Osama bin Laden never dared. He declared a caliphate. While al-Qaeda had long envisioned an eventual Islamic government, it had remained focused on global jihad against Western powers, viewing state-building as premature. Baghdadi, in contrast, accelerated that process, abandoning the gradualist approach and declaring himself Caliph Ibrahim in 2014. This bold proclamation was a direct challenge not only to the West, but also to the foundational ideologies of al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood thinkers, and traditional Sunni scholars. It shattered the existing jihadist hierarchy and threw the militant world into ideological disarray. The Islamic State under Baghdadi redefined the structure of jihadist operations. Gone were the elusive sleeper cells and symbolic attacks from mountain caves. In their place came an organization that combined guerrilla warfare, conventional military tactics, and administrative governance. It held territory, levied taxes, printed currency, and educated children. It operated like a nation and advertised itself as one. Foreign recruits arrived by the thousands, including women, doctors, engineers, and journalists. Never before had a terrorist group succeeded in constructing a fully fledged proto-state under such extreme ideological pretense. But it wasn't just the establishment of a caliphate that made Baghdadi's impact so significant, it was the unapologetic cruelty with which it was maintained. Under his rule, atrocity became a language of legitimacy. Executions were staged for theatrical impact. Beheadings were filmed with cinematic quality. Enslavement and rape were justified with theological citations. Religious minorities, Yazidis, Christians, Shia Muslims were systematically targeted for extermination or subjugation. Entire populations lived in fear, with death or mutilation as punishment for the smallest infraction. Baghdadi had transformed the theological lexicon of jihadism. His version of Islam was rigid, exclusionary, and weaponized. He revived historical practice stimi taxation, slave markets, and apostasy executions, not as relics, but as living instruments of policy. This hardline interpretation drew criticism from all corners of the Islamic world. Even scholars from ultra-conservative institutions such as Al-Azhar in Cairo condemned Is as heretical. But Baghdadi's appeal was never academic, it was psychological. To many disillusioned youth, particularly in Europe and North Africa, he offered purpose, belonging, and vengeance. He offered a black-and-white world where suffering had meaning and violence was sacred. The media ecosystem Baghdadi's followers built was as impactful as his army. Through platforms like Al Furqan Media, a mock news agency, and Dabiq magazine, the Islamic State flooded social media with imagery of conquest, purity, and fear. Children were shown firing rifles. Fighters rode in parades through seized cities. Executions were presented as divine justice. Baghdadi's ideology reached across oceans, radicalizing individuals in Orlando, Nice, Manchester, and Berlin who killed in his name even if they had never set foot in Syria or Iraq. This decentralized, ideology-driven model of jihad became the blueprint for future lone wolf terrorism. Even as the physical caliphate collapsed, Baghdadi's influence endured. His franchising model establishing Islamic State provinces in distant geographies kept the organization alive globally. Boko Haram in Nigeria rebranded as IS West Africa Province. Fighters in Libya, Afghanistan, and the Philippines pledged allegiance. Baghdadi's vision of a global Islamic empire, loosely united under his authority, had planted seeds far from his desert command posts. For Western governments, Baghdadi's reign triggered a rethinking of national security, refugee policy, counterterrorism strategy, and digital monitoring. The unprecedented wave of foreign fighters that flowed into IS territory created intelligence blind spots. Returnees became both suspects and political liabilities. Countries wrestled with how to prosecute women who joined the Islamic State, how to de-radicalize children raised under its flag, and how to manage the long-term threat of ideological contagion. Inside Iraq and Syria, the scars left by Baghdadi's rule ran deep. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Ethnic and sectarian tensions had been inflamed. Trust between communities, already fragile after years of war, was shattered by the Islamic State's brutality. The Yazidis remained displaced, with thousands of their women and girls still missing. Sunnis in IS-held areas, many of whom were coerced into complicity or victimized themselves, faced marginalization and suspicion. Rebuilding would take decades, not only of infrastructure, but of social and spiritual repair. In the end, Baghdadi's attempt to rewrite Islamic and geopolitical history failed. His caliphate collapsed. His name became synonymous with depravity. Yet the methods, networks, and rhetoric he unleashed would outlive him. The image of a scholar turned warlord, a theologian turned slaver, continues to influence those who romanticize the past and weaponize religion in pursuit of power. His death did not end the story. As one intelligence official said, "You can kill the man, but not the idea." The world that Baghdadi helped shape with its decentralized terror cells, its use of media as weaponry, and its drive for apocalyptic theocracy remains a volatile and unfinished landscape. His name may fade, but the consequences of his rule will echo through history's darker corridors for years to come. Part 9. Memory of a Tyrant. Myth, Obscurity, and the Reckoning of History. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi died not in the splendor of a throne room, but buried beneath the rubble of a rural Syrian tunnel, cornered, desperate, and detonating himself rather than surrendering. For a man who once stood on the pulpit of the great mosque of al-Nuri and declared himself Caliph of all Muslims, the ending was tragically fitting in. Emperor of sand, undone by the very fear he had long imposed upon others. Yet, with his physical demise, a deeper question emerged. How would the world remember him? What would history make of this obscure scholar turned genocidal ruler? In many ways, Baghdadi's story defied easy comparison. He was not the charismatic revolutionary like Che Guevara, nor the messianic preacher like bin Laden. He was austere, elusive, and often described by contemporaries as unremarkable. His early life was one of religious quietude marked by failed academic ambitions, soft-spoken demeanor, and a preference for solitude. And yet, through a confluence of war, ideology, and ambition, he became the architect of the most violent jihadist state of the modern era. Unlike his jihadist predecessors, Baghdadi claimed political sovereignty. He did not merely direct terror, he governed. He taxed, executed, legislated, and enslaved, under the banner of religious absolutism. The black flag of the Islamic State was not just a symbol of militancy, but the signature of an actual regime. For a brief and terrifying moment, Baghdadi ruled over millions of people, from Mosul to Raqqa, imposing his medieval vision of the world by gunpoint and decree. His decision to assume the title of Caliph was not only bold, it was deeply strategic. In the eyes of devout traditionalists, only a man from the Quraysh tribe could legitimately claim such a title. Baghdadi, through tenuous tribal lineage, asserted that he was descended from the Prophet Muhammad's tribe, cementing an aura of divine right. This claim infused his movement with eschatological fervor. In regions like Iraq and Syria where state structures had collapsed and sectarian conflict had hollowed out society, Baghdadi's vision of a unified, pure Islamic state resonated with the disillusioned. Yet this claim to sanctity was married to systematic cruelty. His rule institutionalized rape, normalized slavery, and made atrocity a form of state communication. Executions were spectacles. Children were indoctrinated as soldiers. Religious minorities were declared subhuman. Baghdadi's Islamic State blurred the line between the medieval and the modern crucifixions filmed in 4K, propaganda adorned with Quranic scripture, and social media used as a recruiting tool for genocide. His caliphate was a nightmare dressed as prophecy. Still, even within the extremist world, his legacy was divisive. Al-Qaeda, once the dominant force in global jihadism, denounced Baghdadi's arrogance and brutality. Prominent Sunni scholars and institutions declared him a usurper and a heretic. Even jihadist ideologues were uncomfortable with the rapidity and ferocity with which he executed his vision. His rise fractured the jihadist movement into rival factions, some choosing ideology over state-building, others seduced by Baghdadi's brute force utopia. Outside the Islamic world, Baghdadi became a cipher for evil. His name, like that of Hitler or Pol Pot, became shorthand for moral collapse. Western media depicted him as a phantom dictator, a theological psychopath, or the face of medieval barbarism. Yet he remained curiously unknowable. While bin Laden left behind a treasure trove of personal writings and video addresses, Baghdadi left almost nothing. His invisibility became his mystique. In historical terms, Baghdadi belongs to a lineage of revolutionary rulers whose grand experiments ended in fire. Like Robespierre, who unleashed the reign of terror only to be consumed by it, Baghdadi believed he was building a purifying state. And like Robespierre, his system turned inward and devoured itself. His caliphate alienated allies, massacred civilians, and collapsed under the weight of its own extremism. The puritanical dream proved too cruel to endure. Yet, perhaps the most chilling part of Baghdadi's legacy lies not in what he did, but in what he proved possible. He demonstrated that with the right combination of ideology, brutality, and propaganda, a small group of militants could seize control of major cities, redraw borders, and challenge the international order. He showed how modern tools, social media, encrypted messaging, digital branding could be used to resurrect ancient forms of violence. And he reminded the world that failed states, abandoned populations, and unaddressed grievances could give rise to monsters. Today, The Islamic State continues to exist in fragmented cells. New leaders have emerged, and the dream of a caliphate still flickers in the minds of radicals across continents. But none have yet matched Baghdadi's combination of clerical authority, strategic cunning, and brutal vision. His caliphate may be gone, but its echoes remain in the camps of Syria, in the memories of survivors, and in the security calculations of every nation that once dismissed him as a marginal figure. Abu Bakr al Baghdadi is dead, but the world he helped shape of broken states, radicalized youth, and apocalyptic narratives remains very much alive. His was a legacy carved not in stone, but in blood, fire, and fear. And though the man perished in the dust of a tunnel, history will not forget the caliph who tried to resurrect an empire from chaos and drowned the dream in horror.